mistakenly added music to this blank intro card that doesn't need music, and I have no idea how to get rid of it. Now, it's a whole thing, but we'll wait a few moments and then we'll get to work. I promoted this a lot, so hopefully we'll get a nice group. Usually we get 8 to 10 for the news hour, so I'm hoping for at least 3 or 4.
Okay.
All right, close enough. Let's do it. Here we go. Hello, everyone. My name is Cameron Cowan. Welcome to this special live event of the Cameron Journal podcast. I'm going to be joined in a moment by Michael Anderson, who's patiently waiting in the green room. For those of you that don't know, may not have remembered, whatever have you, Michael Anderson is an author of several books, including the one we talked about in our initial conversation, America's Counterfeit Democracy, Rule of the Power Elite. He's also written The Progressive Gene, which frightens me, The Conservative Gene, which frightens me more, The Twilight of the American Experience, Without Moral Balance Our Republic Will Fall, and Tribalism, The Curse of 21st Century America. When we did our initial recording, about his book and all these topics, we knew we could say so much more and talk so much more. And so we're going to be picking up that conversation tonight, by reviewing some more of his work, talking about more of his books, and talking about kind of the current state of politics and how things are going after the first 100+ days of the Trump administration, and kind of where we go on from this moment that we have been experiencing. So, without further ado, there he is. Thank you, Michael. Welcome to the Cameron Journal podcast again.
Thank you for inviting me. Appreciate it.
Yes. Yes. So why don't we, before we get into some of your other books and whatnot, why don't we start from the beginning? When we spoke last, let me get the date exact here. When we spoke last, your episode came out on, when did it come out on? I think it came out sometime in January or maybe February. And it had been recorded, I think, before the Trump administration came. It was published on February 19th. So we recorded that before Trump got into office. So it's been several months and all this sort of thing. What do you think so far? How do you think it's going? We've trade wars, executive orders, all this sort of thing. He seems to be reshaping the country and the world as fast as possible. How do you think that's all going in your view?
I think it's all going very well from the people's standpoint. We may have talked about this before, I'm not sure, but my fifth book basically was about, it was called America's Counterfeit Democracy. And basically, I shifted gears from writing about the differences between the parties to writing about the billionaire control of our society. So when you look at what Trump represents, which is the people, and it doesn't have to be Trump, it could be any populist. He has made tremendous waves in terms of offending the establishment politicians of both parties. The Republican establishment is as big an enemy of his as the Democratic establishment, because both establishment groups are ingrained in their operation mode, getting themselves rich through their term in office, through support and, I don't know, bribes. I don't know what's involved, but Trump is completely stirred up the establishment, basically. And I mean, when you look at Doge, for example, and again, I'm more focused on what Doge is doing rather than giving Trump credit for it. Because I consider myself a moderate in terms of politics. I support the people and not the politicians. But to uncover all this fraud, waste, and abuse is amazing. It's never been done before. And I think the reason for that is because both parties have been involved in the establishment operation to benefit themselves. So there was no incentive for anyone to stir things up. But Trump is doing that because he isn't part of the establishment. He's trying to represent things that the people want to see done, because the Congress has not been effective lately in passing bills and laws that help the American people. They're only helping themselves. So, but I mean, just the scale of the corruption is amazing. The deep state and its bureaucracy, with too many people, too many employees, wasting too much money, and we're all paying for it via our taxes. So that's all been exposed now. And I mean, in my mind, it exposes the Republican Party just as much, because they had to look the other way, as opposed to wanting to investigate what Trump is investigating. So that's a big deal. The other thing I have to say is, and I'm talking in general about Trump here, of course, usually, and I don't know how many cases of this, if you look at all the presidents, I don't know if there's ever been a president that's a businessman before. Typically, they're not. Typically, they're lawyers. I know Herbert Hoover was a engineer, but he wasn't a businessman. And the point of having a businessman run the executive branch is a businessman thinks about efficiency and productivity and things like that. And if you're a lawyer, you're not focused on that. You don't understand it, and I don't think you care about it. So there are things that are part of Trump that aid his stirring up the American society, and so that's why we see what we see.
Well, that yes, I figured that would be about where you where you would go with it. Um, no, that's very helpful. It's I think there I yeah I would agree with you. I think there's definitely a strong desire on the part of a non insignificant amount of voters to um shake up the established forces. That is, certainly, um, something that we even saw with the Bernie Bros. And I on the yesterday on the Cameron Joel News Hour, I talked about why the Bernie Bros went to Trump so easily, and I said it's the same populist impulse. It's just a matter of who's saying it. And there's also this idea that the government does not necessarily work for the everyday person, which is definitely. I mean, I can definitely get with that. Like, I've written about that myself. I've talked about it oftentimes. I think a lot of the stuff with Doge, what the narrative is a bit difficult. Everyone calls it waste, fraud, and abuse. I'm like, actually, only one of those words maybe possibly true, and that's waste, because here's the sad reality. And I think here's where, to get to your point, Congress is very complicit. Doge has not done an excellent job of finding people that are generally ripping off the government, which is kind of sad because Medicare and Medicaid have that in spades. But what they have done is they've discovered how, through decades and decades, with different laws, especially revenue pieces of legislation, Congress has piled on ever more programs, ever more grants, ever more agencies, ever more things onto this sort of ever expanding, creeping aspect of government. And to go through and ask the question, which I think Doge has asked, is why on earth are we, the taxpayers, paying for, transgender operas in Slovenia, sort of thing, or why we're supporting, the arts in Ireland when our arts are not being funded, sort of thing, why we're doing all that, I think it is an important question to ask. And the reality, to your point, is there's a lot of quid pro quo that goes on in the background. And I think a lot of Congress people, especially those that don't want to stay there for a long time, do set themselves up to go run the aforementioned NGO backed by the government grant, or to set themselves up for lobbying or in the private sector, whatever have you. And it becomes a real revolving door of money. And that doesn't even get into the corruption with campaign donations, super PACs, dark money, all that type of thing. And so that shaking up that system is definitely important and vital. But I think the real blame of all that really ends with Congress, and that unfortunately is not the conversation we're ending up having, which I think is interesting. A little bit of a narrative difference there.
Well, I would call, I called out both the establishment left and the establishment right,
No, I'm not
and
saying you. I'm
they,
just saying in public in the mix. You are on
oh,
point.
okay,
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
okay,
Yeah.
okay.
No, I was just in terms of how we as a society are talking about this stuff. We're not laying the blame at Congress, who's been packing the government full of this stuff for so long. So to your point, it is finally being brought out and exposed and all this sort of thing. And so I think that's I think it probably is time to review a lot of these programs and whatnot. And I think the way Trump has done it has circumvented Congress people digging their heels in to protect their favorite pet programs and pet agencies and pet grants and all this type of thing. The Bush administration ran into this when they were trying to close military bases in in the early 2000s because the Cold War was over and we needed many fewer bases than we had, and no congressperson wanted their base to be closed. And so it was hell getting base closures through Congress because there goes 5,000 jobs in your district sort of thing. And, so the way they've done it has circumnavigated that fight in Congress, which I think is interesting.
Well, they still, all the stuff, many of the executive orders have to be validated by Congress. For example, the DOGE
Yeah.
cuts, like U.S. aid, that has to be voted on by Congress to make those cuts permanent.
Yes, and I think it'll be very interesting to see what all happens when those votes start coming up. I know they're planning on doing a lot in budget reconciliation,
Right.
which is a must pass, can't be filibustered sort of thing, which I think, is certainly, I mean, and I will say this, as much as we may not like it, it is certainly a way to get it done. I won't deny
Right.
it is a way to get it done, even though many of us may not be excited about it. It is certainly a way to get the job done.
Right.
So, excellent. So we actually, you'd meant as we were going to be having comments and questions when we started this, and we have one, and I'm going to post it now. So this person has written in and said, Trump coin, Qatar jet, Doge hacks, how many times has Doge changed their number? Doge has cost the taxpayer more money with rehires than they have saved, sending people off the street, on and on and on. Which is, I think, one aspect of the narrative that people can look at and be kind of like, how effective are these people really? I did a story a couple weeks ago talking about how the cost of firing all the people Doge has fired is going to be like $135 billion in severance packages and everything, which is just absolutely kind of crazy and insane sort of thing. And it's a difficult. I think one of the things I've observed, I don't know how you feel about this. I think especially Elon, because he's given up and gone back to private business, but other people have discovered it's not as easy to cut down the beast as one thought it would be. I
Right.
think that they were going to go in and just whack it all apart and, and huge cost savings. As it turns out, it's not that easy.
No, because there's such resistance to it, and so between the establishment groups, lobbyists, corporations, or whatever, they're going to try and stop it. So
Absolutely.
that does, and look at what the courts are doing. So the left is using district court judges to stop programs that apply to the whole country, which historically hasn't been done really, and it shouldn't be done, but it's happening.
Yeah, well, federal court, a federal court injunction is a federal court injunction. It gives people time to get relief for sure. And yes, I mean, they're definitely, the fight is definitely going down in the court system,
Yeah.
and I mean that's obviously depending on what perspective you have. You're either going to look upon that as a really great favorable thing, or it's runaway judges at it again sort of thing. I kind of look at this all as, and I'm not necessarily a huge fan of Doge cuts and all this sort of thing, but I do view this as the mess of democracy at work. And I think, and I want to get your perspective on this, I think one of the interesting aspects is, for the longest time, it seemed like nothing ever changed. No matter who you voted for, what we did, the system
Right.
by and large kind of just kept rolling along. And now, for the first time, a little spanner has been thrown in the wheel of the bicycle, as it were.
Yep.
And I think the fact that things are happening, there is democracy mess, there is things being talked about and whatnot. I don't know if you think, but I think people like that because it seems like at least something's happening. Something's
Yep.
trying to be changed. The system isn't just rolling us all over.
Yep. Well, I don't know if you ever heard this quote, but Benjamin Franklin said, "We need to have a revolution every 200 years to get out all the corruption uh, and corruption."
Yeah.
And we didn't do it. We had a revolution in 1776. We didn't have one in 1900, but maybe this is it for 2000. Because I mean
Yeah.
everything gets corrupt sooner or later, because people get complacent and money gets wasted, and it's easier to operate the status quo than change it. Change is hard, And so the government just grows without any controls. But now we're at $35 trillion national debt, and our debt has passed $1 trillion a year. And pretty soon it would be large enough that we would be bankrupt essentially if we just keep it growing.
Yes, and I think it was kind of interesting the White House presented its budget request to Congress, and I was surprised at how modest the savings was. It was only about 163 billion. I was anticipating much bigger, deeper cuts, but that didn't really seem to happen. And combined with the tax cuts they want to do, could definitely be difficult on the deficit front. You know,
Right,
R.I.P. deficit hawks.
right.
You know, sort of thing. So yeah, it's a very yes. It there is when it comes to making big reforms in a big organization, it is no easy thing, and there definitely is a lot of resistance. I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I think it's good to have the mess of democracy at work because it gives us a chance for many people for the first time in their lives to really talk about this stuff and not just have it go on forever without it ever being questioned. And I think that's probably the most difficult part for a lot of people is all of a sudden things that we thought were permanent, were never going away, are suddenly, you know, everything's up for grabs, everything's up for question.
Yeah, no, I think that's great too. I I'm on Twitter a lot. I post on there and I read it every day. Read the other people's posts, but very often people are posting such and such happened yesterday. That's never happened before,
Yeah.
and I think it's healthy for people to understand that you can make changes in government and we're still here. I mean, our government system is very stable. And so you
Yeah.
can make a lot of changes to it without interrupting its operation.
Yes. And to that, speaking of Twitter and people on Twitter, I want to turn to your book on tribalism, which we didn't really get to talk about in our first interview because we were talking about democracy. And so, as you and I both have mentioned, sort of, have both watched tribalism get much, much worse. And we talked a little bit in our first interview about why that is and all this sort of thing. But I want you to tell me a little bit about that book, how you came to write it, and why you think tribalism is so bad now.
Well, my first book was The Progressive Gene, and the idea there was describing how the left thinks. And then I thought, well, I'll write a book about the conservative gene because I'll write about both sides. But that was in Progressive Gene came out in 2017, and then tribalism got bad in 2018 and 19, middle of Trump's first term. And I just thought tribalism was a bigger problem to write about than why the left and right are different. And I mean, I think we talked about this before. Maybe we didn't, but basically, you know, the right doesn't have an ideology. Conservatism is status quo and traditions. The way the left has an ideology, the left ideology is working for change and working for equality. Basically, is what, at least on the radical left, that's the plan. There's socialists on the radical left that want to change our society. There's plenty of other Democrats that want to just have a welfare state, leave it the way it is. But the Democrats push change, the Republicans resist change. So there have been, you know, in the early 2000s and the aughts, we went through probably there were three different eras of cultural revolution. You know, the 60s, the 80s, and then the aughts. And I mean, the more the left pushed social change, the more the right resisted it because they resist everything. And it's too much. I mean, it's not like the right won't allow change. They like a pace of change that they can tolerate. I
Mm.
mean, I think people on the right accept the fact there are generational changes. Each generation brings new ideas, new point of view. The older people's ideas pass away. But when there's too much change too quickly, then the Republicans resist, the conservatives resist. And of course, most of the religious people, or a very large percentage of religious people, are conservative. So They see attacks on religion, for example, as something they're going to resist, or changes in society, social change in society, more permissiveness or whatever, they're going to resist. So the tribalism came from the right resistance to the left, the right feeling there's too much change and change they couldn't accept. So both groups gravitated into tribes, and the tribes became the dominant feature of each party, and the tribes began to represent the ideology of each party, and that provided air cover for a lot of people that don't pay attention to politics. It made you don't have to think. If you join a tribe, then I just say what my tribe says. I don't have to think. I don't have to be in the middle. I don't have to evaluate ideologies to see which one's better. I just take the ideology of my tribe.
No, I think there's something to that, especially for those people that are very apolitical. That one of the things that was very different in narrative about the 2024 election, and there was excellent reporting on this, I believe, at Vox, that talked about how the political narratives of the 2024 election, especially on the right, were dominated by specifically apolitical comedy podcasts, other things that politics is not their main thing. Like this show, we do a lot of news and politics, so that's like my thing. We also talk to writers about literature, sort of thing. We had one of those talked on recorded yesterday. But we do a lot of news politics here, and and really it was a election for non-news junkies, not people like you and me who do this all the time, but the apolitical non-news junkies. And the 2024 election, really the story was about the non-political people getting in and really getting involved, voting, caring, hearing stuff, and experiencing things for the first time.
Yep. I want to comment on somebody posted a comment there. Can you see it?
Yes.
There just I think it said that's because we think differently.
Let me look. I'm looking through the comments and I'm not seeing. Let's see. We have.
Oh,
Well, I did post one that said we were born this way, which I thought was funny about the tribalism.
oh, yeah. Oh, that
Yeah.
was you. Oh,
Well, no,
okay.
that was a commenter. I just put it on the screen for everybody.
Yeah, okay. But I mean,
Yeah.
I wanted to take off on that for a second, and just
Sure.
for
Yeah.
for those that haven't read about it, the left and right are different genetically, and so there's a liberal mindset and there's a conservative mindset, and they're different, and one can't turn into the other. There's a lot of people in the middle, ideological middle, that don't have an ideology. Those are the moderates and the independent voters, but uh, as far as you move toward the right and left, you get more ideologically driven and more genetically driven. So, but the point I want to make is that we have two types of people in our society, two ideological views that are important. They both have value. There's value in change in what the left tries to do. There's value in traditions and what the right tries to protect. And the point of all that is our society needs to move forward by consensus. We don't have any consensus now. We just have tribalism. And so the fact that we have tribalism plays into uh, the benefit of the billionaires, because as long as the public is fighting itself, we're not fighting them. So it makes it easy for them.
Well, and it's funny. So this is a bit of an incendiary comment. We're gonna post it. How convenient! The right is all free thinkers and traditionalists, and the left just wants to trans everything with their radical socialism. Okay, we're experiencing some tribalism right now.
Yeah.
This is this is what we're talking about. But I think it is. I think when it comes to when you're talking about, as Bernie Sanders would say, the millionaires and billionaires.
Right.
I think one of the things the conversation we resist having in this country is we're very comfortable talking about left and right, and much ink has been spilled by me, by you, by others on this subject. We have very hard time having a conversation about class up and down. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that was one of the things coming out of Occupy and my involvement in that, and the popularization of Bernie Sanders and the whole Bernie movement and all this type of thing, is we started to have a very uncomfortable conversation about class. And this country is very uncomfortable having conversations about class. It's very uncomfortable talking about, wealth inequality and what we can do to make a society where everyone, not just the very wealthy, thrive. And that's a very hard conversation for people to have, because that means that there are differences, and the unfortunate reality, and I've said this before and I'll say it again, your wages, your money, the reason you can't buy a house, can't afford a car, can't afford to have kids, is because we decided to give all of our money to about 300 people.
Right.
Sort of thing. It's like, for example, Elon Musk does not need $400 billion, neither does Mark Zuckerberg, but we as a country have decided to make sure their pockets are never empty, to the detriment of 330 million people,
Right, but we have control over that. We don't exercise that control. If we start voting out the establishment people who take the graft, and we started putting in people who are young, aggressive, and would understand that they got elected to perform, then the Congress would change. But it has no momentum to change, no reason to change, because they're fat, dumb, and happy, and we don't do anything about it.
Well, I mean, yes, but I think we also have to remember, I mean, there is, in many cases, a dedicated, and this is where money in government is the problem. When you have establishment players and establishment parties who have billions at their disposal to spend on elections, messaging, consultants, all this type of thing, and they're both guilty of it. This is a whole universal thing. I mean, if you're a new upstart candidate, you have two options. You either have to exist within that system to get the money to toe the line to get into office, at which point you're probably going to end up like them, or you have to get into power outside of that system, which is what
Right.
Donald Trump did, ostensibly. And so it's a very, so I mean, I think that's one of the reasons why we have less turnover in Congress. Now, I agree with you. Congress is way too old. The average age of Congress is like 56.
Yeah.
I mean, it is in that you do not have people in Congress who have families, young children, are managing older parents. I mean, what a lot of us I'm 37 years old, what a lot of us like our age are managing, our voices are not present in seats in power in government.
Exactly.
And that, I mean, how different, and I've always joked, I said, when we can finally pry power from the cold dead hands of the boomers, people are going to be frightened at how fast society changes, because there'll be all this pent up demand for change.
Right. Let me make another comment, because you're exactly right about the obstacles to people in primaries. But my proposal and my theory, and it's maybe questionable whether you could execute, if we're going to replace the establishment, you have to replace them at the primary. You can't replace them at the general, because you have to, if there's a Democrat running against a Democrat in a primary, and you have one 30-year established Democrat incumbent, and then you have a newcomer, people have got to vote for the newcomer.
Right.
And so if somebody can get the financing they need to get on a primary ballot, they have a chance. And the reason it has to happen in the primaries is because if both incumbents get nominated, I mean, Democrats are never going to vote for a Republican to replace their person.
Right.
And the same on the other side. So you
Right.
have to replace, like AOC did, for example. You have to replace the incumbent at the primary level, and that's how you replace them in a general election.
No, that is. I mean, no. I mean, and the thing about it, especially when we get out of national, get into local government, state houses, governors, even down to your city council and everything, it's more achievable because it's smaller and it's cheaper. But it's also very important. I mean, you end up with these people who have been in for. I mean, this is why, to some degree, it's nice that a lot of states have term limits, because it kind of forces a certain amount of turnover as time goes by. And that's why a lot of people, on social media will definitely complain we need term limits for Congress people and senators. Maybe House reps 4 terms, senators 2 terms. That's it. Out you go. To
Yeah,
kind of force that turnover to happen.
great idea, but how do you implement it? Because they'll never vote it in.
No, I mean that it is one of those that's difficult to do. In
Mhm.
Colorado, when we brought in term limits for the state house, it was by state refer. It was not by refer. It was by state petition. We put
Yeah,
it, the voters put it on the ballot. We went right around the state capitol and put it in anyway, sort of thing. And we don't have that. We don't have that function at the national level, so we're stuck. You know.
yeah, we're stuck. Yeah.
Um, it's a very difficult thing. This is a great point. You would think with how the rest of government is funded, our elections would be treated the same. Yeah, one would hope, but sadly enough, not. Um, in your view with tribalism, how do you feel like we break the back of tribalism? Because the problem is getting worse, not better. I kind of I struggle because I run a very middle of the road centrist moderate show. I get a lot of compliments for that. I sometimes get a lot of incoming for that. So I'm trying to do my part to provide a venue, a pagoda of moderate centrism sort of thing, where we can have the type of conversation we're having right now. In your view, how do we break up the tribalism deadlock?
Well, before I answer that, I want to make a comment, and that is that Trump is a lightning rod for tribalism himself
Yes.
because he is so polarizing that we need to have a discussion about what could happen now versus what could happen in 28 when Trump's gone.
Right.
Because if he's gone, there's a lot of tribalism that will go with him. Um,
True.
in the last chapter of my book, I speculated about what are the things that could stop tribalism. I said 3 things. One is a 9/11 type event because there were event like that. I mean, when 9/11 happened, we were united as a country in 24 hours. No
Right.
question about it.
Yeah.
Don't want that kind of awful thing to happen to end tribalism, but it could. I thought COVID would be it, but COVID immediately got politicized.
Yeah.
So it failed because I thought, well, gee, we all, as a country, we've all got to attack the pandemic, and it's a unifying factor, but it wasn't. It was made political, so it didn't work.
No, I
Uh,
wrote an article called Our Politicized Pandemic, where
yeah,
I wrote about that quite extensively and got into some research and whatnot and broke through those narratives. Because as I always tell people, news is a narrative, that's why they call it a story. And that, and that was, I agreed. I was hoping for more unity and more coming together. And the pandemic drove us farther apart, especially when you get into lockdowns, vaccine mandates, the vaccine at all. Masking became politicized. I mean, just everything got blended through a tribal lens,
yep.
and that made things very very difficult.
Okay, so number one was a 9/11 event. Number two uh, could possibly be fatigue,
Mm,
where everybody realizes that how stupid tribalism is because it makes our government ineffective, and that hurts the American people. So why not um, consider uh, building consensus rather than driving us apart?
hmm.
Um, Number three choice is something like um, letting time change things. That what the zeitgeist is, right? So the
Yes.
zeitgeist is a change in the spirit of a society that I don't know. Usually happens every 10 or 20 years, and sometimes external events cause it to change. But um, it this may wear itself out. I don't know. I don't see the end point of that. We'll have to see what happens after 28. But um, if one thing, and I'm not picking on the Democratic Party here, but if the Democratic Party moved more to the center from where were in the last election, there'd be more consensus building there. Because I mean, I've seen polls of traditional Democrats who agree that that they don't like tribalism and are interested in working with the other side for consensus. So, and the extremes of both parties don't want to do that. So as long as they handle the narrative and the publicity and the propaganda, we don't make any progress.
No, one of the dynamics. I'm glad you brought that up because one of the dynamics I've observed, and I was having this conversation with someone else recently, and I said I think one of the problems is right now we're in a terrible situation where the right wing, the farthest of the far right and the farthest left of the far left are in narrative control. They're the ones that are setting the narrative and the framing. The problem is they're so far apart, it's very difficult for them to come together on anything, and everyone else is left in the middle, sort of thing.
Exactly.
Which is why the largest political party in this country is non-independent. Sort of thing. People are kind of, they're getting off both boats for no boat. Sort
Right.
of thing.
Exactly.
Um,
Well, and
and
it's
there's some,
unfortunate
yeah,
unfortunate that the media carries the controversy because that gets more readers. So if
yes.
something in the extreme, someone on either extreme expresses themselves or makes some rant or racist statement or whatever it might be, that's what gets publicized, not the opinions of the people in the middle.
No, and I mean, and I think also if you look at the voices that get elevated, and speaking of media, the mainstream media has a very bad habit of platforming what I call the worst voices, a Matt Walsh, a Nick Fuentes, all this type of thing. Conversely, Fox News and a lot of right wing places love to sometimes platform not necessarily the loudest voices, but some of the kind of the people who kind of say the craziest stuff. And so what you end up with from a media narrative perspective is you end up with well, the Democrats are crazy because they're advocating for this crazy left thing, even though it has nothing to do with what any candidate has said, what the party is saying, like that, but it's this crazy voice over here. And also conversely, you end up with the same problem of you get this extra focus on really marginal voices within any of these parties, but because they're the ones getting the media attention, they're the scions of what unquote the other tribe is thinking, and that becomes the narrative. And I always tell the classic story. The classic case of this was defund the police. It's
Yeah.
a great marching slogan. It's an absolutely terrible way to run a city, and it's an
Yeah.
absolutely awful policy. But you
Right.
have all these people convinced that this is what the will of the entire Democratic Party is, when it's like, no, that was thought up by a handful of activists in New York City in 2020 as a clever marching slogan and has nothing to do with actual policy, and the cities that tried to implement it fell flat on their faces. And I know
Right.
because I lived in one.
Right.
Sort of thing. And so this so you I think given the outsized influence of social media, the ability to garner attention, and the mainstream media, both sides, their obsession of platforming the most extreme stuff because, to your point, it gets clicks. I think that is a major contributor. And if we really, I think, want to slow down on the tribalism, I think we have to really change. The mainstream media has to shift narrative in a big way.
Let me summarize what you just said in one sentence.
Do.
Like everything else, politics has become entertainment. So entertainment,
Yes.
it's entertainment. So that's why people with crazy ideas get a platform because it's entertaining. I complain about sports now being it's all entertainment.
And it's
And,
story and
and
narrative, like it's all about the story of the player and their. You watch these things
yeah,
like before the Super Bowl, and it's kind of like there's their family in the house they grew up in. I'm like, I thought we were watching football. I came for
right,
football. I don't know what y'all are here for. Like it's
right.
yeah. No, there is definitely an entertainment aspect to it, and I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of the media that's done well in this time is comedy shows. Like that as a political medium has become a big force, and I think it's because they've mastered that place of sort of edutainment sort of
Yeah.
thing, and why they do so well in this environment. Um, I don't even know how. The problem is I don't know how we get out of it. Like how we unwind. I think you're the last thing you brought up is probably right. It's probably gonna have to wear itself out, kind of like the '60s. We
Yeah.
we wore ourselves. We're just gonna have to live into the answer on this one, and eventually, one day, will the country will wake up and decide we're over it. America's a trendy country, and eventually the trend will move.
Yeah. I
Eventually.
yeah. I think
That
so.
is, yeah, that is definitely a strange and crazy factor. The last thing I want to, we're almost to the top of the hour, but I want to ask about one more thing. The twilight of the American experiment. Without moral balance, our republic will fall. I want to end on that.
Okay. That book has a very simple premise. It's a complaint about the left's takeover of all the institutions of our society.
Mm,
And the complaint is based on the fact that that means that one side has the majority of the platforms and the other side doesn't. And it's a plea for a more evening out of the narratives that get presented to the American people. And I'm talking about basically the higher education systems are mostly progressive. There are very few Republican or conservative professors anymore. Mainstream media is left leaning, and social media is left leaning, other than Twitter, basically. And of course, the reaction to the one sidedness is the advent of things like Substack and podcasts, because conservatives can make their own platform then, since they can't use the traditional platforms.
well,
So,
and let's face it, the
the,
conservative influence on new media has been outsized. I
right,
mean, it's been huge. Yeah.
yeah. It's kind of like the analogy would be when higher education turned left, the conservative professors all joined think tanks, because
Yeah.
there are conservative think tanks that you can go to and express your views and your philosophy when you write articles, as opposed to being on higher ed.
Cato Institute, Heritage
Right.
Foundation, et al. Sort
Yeah.
of thing. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. That's Why do you think that's bringing to the twilight of the American experiment?
Well, the American experiment is two parties, two groups working by consensus. I mean, even go back to uh, Alexander Hamilton against Thomas Jefferson, states' rights versus federal government, balance in government, balance in communication. So it's an experiment. The experiment is everybody, all the public point of views get represented. And my feeling is that with these changes and move to the left, um, by higher ed and traditional media, then it skews what the public is exposed to.
And I think one of the reasons why new media has done so well is I think people are hungering for that diversity of view because they obviously don't necessarily know how what to think about a lot of this stuff. They're looking for someone to have the type of conversation we're having to kind of figure it out for themselves and all this sort of thing. And yeah, one of the conversations I have with a lot of my fellow journalists of the left persuasion is how we're so underrepresented in this new medium that we're all participating in, sort of thing. And we've had a lot of conversations on how to kind of expand our influence in new media. And in one of these discussions, I said, you know what part of the problem is? And everyone's like, what? As I said, part of the problem is the mainstream media sucking all the air out of the room. We can't grow.
Right.
The right has the advantage of having not many other places to go. You've got Fox News, OAN, Newsmax. We have to compete with all of cable news, all of network news, and major newspaper. I mean, there's not a lot of space for us to grow because of the way the mainstream media is, and it's going to be very hard to be involved in a lot of these narratives in that sort of environment.
Right.
And
But I
the
think
mainstream media is very good at only hiring a certain person from a certain background that does not include people like me.
I think you could replace the mainstream media if you're successful, because people would rather go to Substack and read a Democratic point of view, I think, than they know what the traditional media what side they're on and the bias in their presentation. What
Yeah.
why not? I think people. I mean, the question I get asked most often by people is, "How do I know what the truth is?"
Yeah.
And the answer I give is find somebody you trust on the left and somebody you trust on the right and read both and figure out where the truth is between them because
Yeah.
maybe it's in the middle, but if
Yeah.
it's hard. I mean, when
No, it is very hard. Yeah.
1980 we could listen to Walter Cronkite and say, well, Walter said it so it's true and we didn't have to think about it. Now it's much more difficult to know the truth.
Well, and I think there's a lot of people who still do that, but the names have changed and it's become more diffuse. I think there's a lot of people that are listening to a Schultz, a Rogan, a Logan Paul, different people. There's even a small group that listen to me, sort of thing. And that, I mean, that's just kind of where they go with it because they kind of picked their person and their alignment and they go with that until kind of proven otherwise. And I think people still want that. It's just much more diverse and diffuse than it used to be. But
Yes.
I think the one thing that is cool about this whole new media thing, even though us on the left are getting completely left behind by the right, is it is very reminiscent of the 19th century newspapers and that sort of that push, that pull, that tug, the different headlines, the competition, all that sort of that mess of democracy, but in media sort of thing. It's refreshing because for a long time it was so monolithic. Media was too monolithic, and now we've got mess. We've got things moving and changing. It's become fluid and dynamic, and I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing.
How are you defining new media? Because you're on new media right now.
No, that's what I'm saying. Our
To
lives like this, podcasts, subs to all this stuff, it is made media less monolithic and made it
yeah.
a fluid and dynamic environment.
No, but
But for those
what
of
did
us
you
on the left that participate in new media, our influence is very small. We have many fewer listeners than people on the right do.
really? Why is that? Because they're listening to traditional media?
I mean, again, we've had a lot of conversations about this. I tend to think so. I think it's because the traditional mainstream media is very good at sucking all the money, the subscriptions, and all the oxygen out of the room, and it makes it very hard for new leftist media to grow. Why on earth would you come listen to the Cameron Journal News Hour, the Cameron Journal podcast, when you can just turn on MSNBC? And a lot of those
Because
big networks are also in podcasting now too, and they
yeah.
have bigger marketing budgets, recognizable named brands, hosts, all this type of thing, whereas the right does not have a similar ecosystem, so it allows a Logan Paul, it allows a Joe Rogan, to become really big because you don't have to compete with Chuck Todd, Rachel Maddow, Nicole Wallace, all these other big name leftist types. Whereas I'm competing with Rachel Maddow and Nicole Wallace and everybody at MSNBC, people at CNN, people at ABC, NBC, CBS. All of us in leftist new media are competing with them. Joe
Yeah,
Rogan
but
doesn't compete with Fox News.
I'd rather listen to you than listen to them because they're so obviously biased and you're closer to being objective.
And that's my hope. That's why I stay out here. No, I mean that is the hope. And one of my complaints about them, and one of my problems I have with a lot of what I call the elite leftist media, is they all hire the same people from the same schools, from the same background, usually from the same part of the country. And
Yep.
so when people talk, I'm like, no, they really are in a bubble. I know because I live here in New England now. Like they're in a bubble. Like they don't understand people from out west, where I'm originally from out west. From out west, they don't hire people from state schools to go to those places. I mean, they it's all kind of in this very insular thing, and the lack of diversity, not just in race, but in economic background, in geographic location. Where did you grow up? Where did you go to school? There's a lack of diversity in terms of background that I think is really troublesome. And if they really got serious about diversity, it wouldn't just be about the color of your skin. It would be hire the person from Michigan,
Yeah.
hire the person from Colorado, hire the person who went to school at University of Florida. Hire the person who started out as a podcaster and a substacker, and and get them into doing digital content for you that leads to getting a show, all that type of thing. There's no meritocracy if you didn't go to Columbia. Like
Right.
that's a baseline. If you want to work at any of the big cable news or network news, you need to have gone to Columbia, and you preferably need to be from the East Coast. And if you don't have at least one of those things, you're done for. And that, I think, is one of the reasons why they are slowly dying, and in some cases not fast enough.
No,
Although I do they do have a lot of necessity in terms of doing the expensive reporting we can't do, but it is a bit of a bubble.
yep.
So it's yeah. No, it's no, and this person actually brings up a good point. This is a new voice. Tim Pool is from out west, and he's allowed in the White House. True. And the Trump administration has done a lot of work in terms of bringing in new and different voices. I applied for a pass to the White House press room. Weirdly
Okay.
enough, it's open to everybody, so I applied. But um, we're almost at the top of the hour, Mr. Anderson. Thank you so much for coming on the show again. I really appreciate it. Any final thoughts and plugs you want to do?
No, I mean, we're here for the American people, and we're trying to get a political system that is responsive to the American people. And we've got some obstacles to work through. We've got to fix tribalism, and we've got to take on the billionaires and take some of their control away, so we can have more control about over what the government does.
Yep, I appreciate that. I want to let everyone know that Mr. Anderson, Michael Anderson's books are available on Amazon. They're very easy to find. His original interview is on YouTube, Facebook, and elsewhere, so make sure to go check that out. And thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
I appreciate you inviting me. Thank you.
All right, have a great night, everyone.